"Oh, dear God," Lynda whispered to herself. "Who'd have thought that it would be like this?" She'd never imagined that she'd be walking up to her own front door with her key in her hand and have to stop and wonder if she'd a right to walk in. The thought made her clench hold of the key even more tightly as she approached the front door of 24 Beechwood Avenue, a 1930s semi-detached with a bay window and a neat garden. This was the home she'd walked out of in March 1985, not long after her 40th birthday, over 10 years ago. Lynda brushed back a strand of hair which had strayed from the immaculate styling she'd checked before she got off the train. Her golden hair had sometimes caused envy as well as admiration, but had always made her feel good. Before she'd reached her 40th birthday, it had startled her by beginning to turn grey. Lynda had immediately bought some cheap hair colouring which had, indiscreetly, covered up the evidence that she was no longer as young as she wanted to be. Her daughter Carolyn had, of course, disapproved. Lynda paused to look towards the end of the avenue and the view of the town in the distance. She'd always loved how the rough edges of the moors pushed their way in among the rows and rows of weather-worn sandstone terraced houses. These 2 up and 2 down houses had once been the soot-blackened homes of a resourceful, determined army of workers who, early in the morning, had put on their black leather clogs and marched to the Lancashire cotton mills. Among them had been Lynda's grandmother, Madge Collins, from whom she had inherited not only her strength and resilience, but, unfortunately, also more troublesome characteristics. "You do what you want, Lynda, love," Madge had told her granddaughter when she was a teenager. "There's always folks that think they know better than you. Take no notice, or tell them to go to hell. You've had it tough all your little life, just like your poor mother did, God rest her. You hang on to your dreams, my girl. Be happy. You deserve it." There had been a shower of rain, and it had polished the slate roofs so that they shone silver and black as the taxi driver had driven her from the station through some of the old streets where Lynda had played, worked and flirted as a girl. It wasn't raining, thank goodness, when the taxi drew up outside her home. The last thing Lynda wanted was to arrive wet and bedraggled. She needed to look good, to give her the courage to face them after all these years. It wasn't like her to be scared, but as the train had been about to set off from Guildford station, Lynda had panicked, getting up from her seat for a moment, ready to get off, to run for home. And she would have done, if she'd been sure where home was. Tom Meredith's jealous ex-wife, Suzanne, had made it clear that, in her opinion, Lynda Collins did not belong at Lovedale Manor. "We don't want you here," she'd screamed hysterically when Lynda had tried to talk to her. "You might have fooled my husband, but you never fool me. You're a common little tart who's done too well for herself down here. But it's over now, so get out. Go back to where you came from." The woman who had sat opposite Lynda on the train had made the journey even worse. She was in her 60s and wore a hideous green and purple lumpy tweed suit. She'd squeezed herself in at the other side of the table and had informed Lynda, in a voice shrill with self-importance, that she was going to visit her son and daughter-in-law. "I'll have to give the place a good spring clean as soon as I get there, of course. They both work, so they'll be glad of the help." She had organised this pilgrimage, dedicated to inflicting order and censure, on a self-catering basis, and soon unwrapped a grease-proof package, thrusting it towards Lynda. "I always bring my own. You know what you're getting then. Do you want a tuna sandwich?" Lynda recoiled from the combined smell of tuna and the hard-boiled egg the woman had cracked open. Wishing she'd booked a seat in first class, Lynda had tried to retreat into the glossy shallows of the magazine she'd bought. It had served as a limited barrier to conversation, but then, foolishly, Lynda had been unable to resist taking the small album from her handbag and looking at the slightly faded, treasured photos. She'd wanted to seek some reassurance from the smiling faces from the past, especially the photo of little Michael Sheldon at 3 months old, his tiny hands clutching at a teddy bear bigger than he was. But almost immediately the nosy, beady-eyed woman had leaned across to peer, uninvited, at the photos. "Is that your grandchild?" "Yes." "A boy or a girl?" "A boy." "Has he any little brothers and sisters?" "I don't know." The woman had had her mouth open like a bulging-eyed carp and was wrapping her lips round the hard-boiled egg, but she almost spat it out in her haste to pursue this intriguing line of inquiry. "You don't know?" "No, I've been away." "Oh." The woman had leaned forward eagerly, almost lying across the table to see the next picture in the album, a tall, good-looking woman with a blonde on his arm. "Is that you and your husband?" "Yes," Lynda said curtly, snapping the album shut and staring pointedly out of the window. The front door of 24 Beechwood Avenue had a delicate Art Deco-style flower etched in the glass panel in the centre. Lynda stared at the pale reflection shimmering back at her. Not a young face, but strong and beautiful. The notoriously blonde hair, now more subtly coloured, was today drawn up behind her head in the kind of elegant, classy style she remembered Carolyn had once admired in one of her Nana's Vogue magazines. As a teenager, Carolyn had attached herself to a group of friends who came from families who had money. Her friends' fathers were local businessmen, and their mothers didn't go out to work, but stayed at home. They were smart and sophisticated and wore stylish, expensive clothes. Carolyn had been ashamed of Lynda, the brassy blonde working mum who served pies in a cafe and talked and laughed too loudly, and she'd let her know it. Lynda had never forgotten one particular confrontation. "It's a parents' evening. I'm your mother. Why can't I come? I promised Nana that she could come with me and Dad. You can't both come." "Why not?" "You're only allowed 2 people." "Then your bloody Nana can stop at home." "No, I promised, and I want her to come." "But you don't want me, your mother, there." Carolyn had lost patience then. "No, if you must know, I don't." "Well, hard luck, I'm going." "No, you're not. I don't want you to. You'll embarrass me." "I won't." "Yes, you will. Look at you. Cheap, flashy clothes and all that mascara and bright red lipstick." "Anything else?" Lynda had demanded angrily. "Yes, you talk too loud." Lynda hadn't talked much after that. Not to her daughter, anyway. She'd also found it got harder to talk to John, her husband, who always took Carolyn's side. And then there was his mother. Too often John Stanworth had been forced to choose between her and his wife, and too often he had not chosen Lynda. Sheila Stanworth had been an ever-present cloud over their marriage, clinging to her son and taking over her granddaughter. She had, in her quest for supremacy, quietly convinced Carolyn that it was she, not Lynda, who was the one who cared the most, and who knew what was best for her. Sheila had insidiously worked at convincing Carolyn that Lynda didn't want to be at home looking after her. As a child, she hadn't understood why her mummy wasn't there. She hadn't really been aware that Lynda had had to work, that there was no choice financially if Carolyn was to have all the clothes and opportunities that her mother had never had. So they'd stopped talking, Lynda and her daughter, because their conversations always turned into arguments which neither of them had been willing to lose. And in the end, they had lost each other. Today, Lynda was returning to Millfield to try to put everything right. But now, as she stood looking at her reflection in that door, she noticed the fear in her eyes. It had come back, even after all this time, that old fear of not being good enough, of being rejected. Even now, at 52, she could still be frightened like a child in the schoolyard and still react by lashing out instinctively to defend herself. That old fear always brought out the worst in her. It could still make her forget all that she'd learned in the last 10 years, all that Tom Meredith and his love had taught her. Straightening her shoulders, Lynda drew up the deep, soft collar of her black cashmere coat so that it framed her face, gently comforting her. Then a dark cloud of memories suddenly blurred the image in the glass and made her turn and walk hurriedly back down the path. She knew she was running away from that house, just as she had in 1985, which seemed a lifetime ago now. She knew she would probably never have come back to Millfield if Tom Meredith hadn't needed her to promise to find the courage. Lying there against the cluster of soft pillows on their bed, with Lynda sitting beside him, he tried to make a joke of it, like he did with everything that really mattered to him. "You don't want me to have to hang around as a restless spirit to make sure you're all right." He'd stopped there because he'd seen her tears. He'd held her hand even more tightly and made her look into his eyes. "It's worth a try, love. Everything's worth a try," he'd said, in that gentle voice which, for the last 10 years, had been the only voice she had needed to hear. Tom had looked up at her with those blue eyes which almost matched her own, those loving eyes which, so often, had sparked in her the strongest passion she had ever known, those eyes which had had to close to end the pain. "They might not want me," she'd whispered. "They're your family, and that's what you need now." He was right, of course, as always. Tom would know her thoughts before she'd found the words or the courage to deal with them. How could she live without him? She'd never ever felt as safe as she had with Tom Meredith, or as happy. She paused and looked back at the bay window of the house, and, although she knew he'd still be at work, she pictured John Stanworth sitting in the living room, watching television, cosy in his armchair by the fire. It used to drive her crazy, the way he'd sit there all the time, mesmerised by whatever was on the magic box. She hesitated again, but then walked along Beechwood Avenue and up to the main road. Of course, it would have to start raining again. She hurried along to the bus shelter and shivered as she stood there alone, looking round at the past. The shops across the road and next to the bus stop didn't look to have changed much while she'd been away, except that the corner shop now sold takeaway pizzas and baked potatoes instead of wool and embroidery silks. She remembered buying balls of green wool there and knitting John a disaster of a sweater, trying, and failing once again, to impress his mother. Sheila Stanworth had been appalled at the idea of her son marrying Lynda Collins, whom she considered to be a common flighty piece. But John had stubbornly refused to listen, and in the end Sheila had realised that if she tried to stop him, she would lose him. Her opposition had upset Lynda, but after the first year of their marriage, she'd given up trying to get along with her mother-in-law and had settled for tongue-biting animosity instead. A cold, damp, chilling wind, having whipped its way across the rough grasses of the Lancashire hills which cradled the town in a begrudged embrace, thrust Lynda against the glass of the shelter and made her shiver even more. A short distance away, a little sharp-eyed woman in her late 60s was battling to stop the wind snatching hold of her red umbrella and empty grey shopping bag. Alice Smith was a bright little finch of a woman, always alert for the crumbs of life she needed from other people's tables. She compensated her self-esteem by observing, and sometimes playing with, the weaknesses of her patrons. As she regained control of her umbrella, Lynda's luxurious coat and small expensive suitcase caught her eye. Alice stopped and gazed up at her. "Is it Lynda?" Trapped in her wide-eyed stare, Lynda tried to smile. "Yes. Hello, Alice." "You're back then? How long has it been?" "Over 10 years." "Yes, it must be. You've come home at last, eh?" "Yeah, sort of." Relieved to see the bus approaching, Lynda managed a tense smile and said, "Nice to see you again." The woman's small, dark eyes glittered with the excitement of speculation as she anticipated the effect of Lynda's return on certain inhabitants of Millfield. "Yes, I'll say the same," Alice responded, "though there's those that wouldn't." Lynda quickly got on the bus, and Alice smiled and waved, thinking that, although there would indeed be people who would not welcome this woman back to Millfield, she was glad Lynda was back. Alice, an incurable gossip, who couldn't always resist doing mischief, had never had many friends. When her widowed father, her sole companion, had died, People had offered polite sympathy and then swiftly moved on. Apart from Dan Hayward, the owner of the bakery where Alice worked, Lynda had been the only person who had called, not once but several times, during those desperately lonely months, to sit and talk and comfort her. Alice had never forgotten that. It was a long time since Lynda had been on a bus. Tom had taught her to drive and, as well as the Mercedes, he'd even allowed her to sit behind the wheel of the classic red MG that had been his pride and joy. He'd wanted to leave it to Lynda, in memory of the happy times they'd had driving around in it together. But Suzanne had insisted that he gave it to their son, Mark. Lynda loved Mark almost as much as Tom had, so she'd been able to accept his having the car, but she'd hated Suzanne for arguing with a dying man. The bus was comfortingly warm, with red and grey plush seats. It was a different creature from the draughty old brown and yellow double-decker buses that used to rattle into town, but the scenery it toured hadn't changed much. A few of the tall chimneys which had stood guard beside the old cotton mills were still there, black against the sky, standing now in stubborn defiance against the modern age. They towered above the sex images on the billboards placed in front of the crumbling buildings of the now derelict local brewery. Grass was growing from the gutters and windows, but the walls still bore the faded name of what had been a favourite local beer. It reminded Lynda now of her teenage years, when she'd served drinks behind the bar in the Black Bull, working as cheap labour for the landlord, her unappreciative father. But she didn't want to revive those bad memories. She'd enough to think about, starting with John and Carolyn. In Millfield town centre, traffic had been moved aside to make more room for shoppers. The bus route now went along the back of the main road, Broad Street, which Lynda and her teenage friends had nicknamed Broadway in the days when it had been lit up with theatres, cinemas and a dance hall. Broadway was the street she had gidded along, arm in arm with girlfriends, laughing at the lads who had huddled in groups to smoke and to shout comments aimed at provoking a response from the girls and, if they were lucky, a bit of encouragement. Now the bus squeezed its way past offices of estate agents and solicitors, as well as local council organisations. Lynda looked out of the windows eagerly, just in case she might by chance catch a glimpse of her daughter, her only child. Would she recognise Carolyn, though? She'd be 30 now, and would probably have a different hairstyle. Lynda hunched her shoulders in embarrassment at the thought that she might not recognise her own daughter. Then she sat up straight and told herself not to be stupid. Of course she'd know her. Nobody changes that much. And yet she was hoping that Carolyn would have changed.